garden.
All right. Okay, that's on your end, right? I think. Okay,
Yeah,
so has everyone seen this before? I don't have to like review all of it if we don't need it, but do you want it for the recording, BJ, or?
pardon?
Do you want the whole meat of the presentation for the recording, or should I kind of just get to my favorite parts?
Oh, we're going to record the whole thing.
Okay. All right. So as I was saying just a second ago, I'm more of a horticulturalist. I love plants, but for anybody who loves plants, you have to appreciate the insect diversity that are drawn to them. And it's sort of just a natural sort of connection with beekeeping and gardening to eventually maybe become a beekeeper. Although I wouldn't say I'm a successful beekeeper. I sure enjoy both pastimes now. So, and as most of you probably know, bees are very much in the news. Last year it was the murder hornets. It's the colony collapse disorder, and I've seen some pretty alarming posts. These civilization's going to collapse here because bees are declining. Uh, even family members that I didn't think were particularly interested in plants or gardening or much of anything in the outdoors have shared some of them and were called to action. And there's a lot of sort of bad information out there, unfortunately. So, these guys are wanting to save the bees, but they don't know what a bee is. That's obviously not a bee on their big poster here, the National Resource Defense Council. That's the Georgia Tech mascot. And Amazon got this off of one of Amazon's pages. But these guys are wanting to sell their wares to people wanting to save the bees for only $18. Wonder how much of that is actually going to bee conservation or environmental conservation. But again, not a bee. Periodical cicada. Let's save the periodical cicadas. So I hope you all are avid gardeners as I am. And so we know who our pollinators are, that ranges from moths to flies to butterflies, bees, of course. Within Georgia, we have about 540 species of native bees. European honeybee is obviously not native. So these are just some of everything but the hummingbird picture are all from my yard. Most of these pictures are from my yard. And we have incredible bee diversity in North America. These are, the small one on the left is not native to Georgia. The desert Southwest actually has the most bee diversity. The carpenter bee there in the middle, we do have. This guy, Joe Wilson, has got a great book. He's got a great social media presence. And if you're ever interested, if you can see my camera, got a really cool poster. I've got it on my freezer here. I think it was like $20. Cool poster. So do we have any new people, new beekeepers in attendance tonight? All right. So have you learned kind of what characteristics we're looking for with the bee? What makes a bee? Usually it's not just the color or the fuzziness, the hairiness, right? So here we have two flies. They look a lot like bees, right? The one on the left looks like a bumblebee. One on the right looks a little more patterned like a honeybee. So we would call these bee mimics. These are actually flies. We can tell pretty clearly because of the eyes. They're not set on the side. They don't have those three eyes on the tops of their heads. And if we got a little closer, we could probably see that they only have one set of wings, not two sets like bees do. These are kind of fuzzy, a little bit hairy. Are these bees? Got some coloration, sort of like a bee on the left. But these are not bees either. These are wasps. And so it can get a little tricky. Sometimes telling them apart, you have to be an entomologist with a pretty strong microscope. But their bodies are a little more segmented, a little more pronounced. And generally you can tell by how they fly sometimes as well. But both of these are wasps, although they look very similar to some of the species of bees. This is where I would insert my obligatory UGA versus Georgia Tech joke, but I'm better than that. My wife is a Georgia Tech grad. I would never go down that road. So these guys here, these are native bees. The photographer here and the researcher, Sam Drogue, he's out of Gwinnett Tech, and he's done a lot of work on the native bees here in Georgia, but beautiful coloration on these guys. So of our species within Georgia, about 70% of them are going to be ground nesters, and about 30% are going to be those cavity nesters, either in hollow stems, drilled out wood, things like that. We know bees pollinate. So why do they pollinate? Because there's flowers out there and they get something by doing that service to the plant. The plants benefit because the plants have to reproduce. It's all about reproducing, right? So they have to draw that pollinator in. Sometimes this happens. This is an example of a perfect flower or a complete flower. In some cases, we have, say, watermelons, cucumber, squash, where there's actually two separate flowers, a male flower and a female flower. So even more important in a situation like that. BJ mentioned apples without bees or some of the flies. Apples really we wouldn't have them. So about 90% of our plants need the help of pollinators to set fruit. So it's important to remember, why does that plant put all of that energy? If we look at this picture of a sunflower, there is a lot of plant resources that go into producing this big flower. So who's the flower for? The florist? The home decorator? Not really even for the plant itself, in a way. It's for the pollinator. So they have, most of the time, co-evolved with their pollinators to attract them to do that of breeding, transferring pollen to another plant or another flower. So what that flower is for, obviously, is to attract its pollinator. We think about this flower here. Anyone have any guesses? You guys have your microphones on? It's one of my favorite flowers. Native plant
or maypop.
Maypop, yeah. I saw this on a pasture visit. So this is a weed if you're trying to grow a hay field or a pasture for your horses or cows. But one of, to me, the most interesting plants out there sort of looks like a ballerina's tutu, and it is doing an excellent job of attracting pollinators. We can see the moth in there, a big, can't see the hiney on that one to know if it's a bumblebee or a carpenter bee. But this plant, this flower, does an excellent job of attracting pollinators. If we think about, the perfect flower, sometimes we might get that question, what are some of the best pollinator plants out there for my bees? Well, if we think about what the bees see, what they're looking for, generally we want a somewhat shallow flower. We want something in the range of white to the softer pastels, and if it has a mild fragrance to it. If it checks all of those boxes, or even a few of those boxes, chances are it's going to be an excellent bee plant or a pollinator plant. But those bees will quickly learn, if there's no reward there for them, they're not going to come back, or they're not going to transfer that pollen, right? So there has to be some sort of reward to the pollinator. And if we think about, a lot of times we're told, or we observe that honeybees are most active in the morning. Well, for most plants, that's when the nectar is most concentrated, is early in the morning. Well, that is why the bees are most active early in the morning. And then when the heat of the day comes, that nectar becomes a little less available until the next day. But eventually, in some of these, especially annual flowers, is once that seed has been set or the pollination has happened, that flower reward is going to end up being done anyway. So, and typically that the flower will change. So it will start to change color. It will start to dry up as that reward is then grown. Has anyone ever grown buckwheat? If you have 100 square feet or 100 acres and you like bees and insects, this is one of the best plants to grow. And you can see this reward and repeat, right? So the plant needs that repetition to move that pollen over and over and over again.
What's it called
Think
again?
about the number of, this is buckwheat. This is just a small little strip. I've got an aerial view of this strip, but you can see that's, you know, I'm focusing on just this one bumblebee, but there's all sorts of activity right behind where the focus of the camera is. Let's see, where was I going? I got kind of entranced in that bee there. A lot of times I'll get the call in the summertime. Somebody's got a misshapen squash or a misshapen cucumber. You know, maybe it's swelled up at one end, but then it tapers off down to nothing. And that's, most of the time, that's incomplete pollination. It was pollinated, but maybe it was only pollinated once or twice. So for good fruit set in something like, say, that bee has to actually come back about 5 times. So you can have pollination once, you can see a bee, but you can still have inadequate fruit set or fruit failure because that repetition didn't happen. Same with apples, same with a lot of these crops. So, you know, the plant needs to keep that reward available so that multiple visits or that repetition can occur. If we think about just insect diversity, you know, I like to have a diverse mixture of plants. Bees in particular are going to like things, like I said, white to the light pastels. You can see a bee in a red flower, but the bees don't see red. Reds are generally going to be more of your hummingbird plants, your butterfly plants. So think about color as you choose your plants and as you kind of mix in your landscape. This is more what a bee sees. So these are some photography images by this guy over in Germany. And so these are what these flowers, very common flowers, dandelion up at the top, rudbeckia or black-eyed Susan at the bottom. And you see how, especially the dandelion, all we see is yellow, but under UV, there's that nectar guide. So it shows the bee where that target is, where it's going to get its reward. And also for the plant, that's where, you know, those flower parts are that are going to need the pollen exchanged. Another quick video here. So I love growing sunflowers. One, because they're so easy, they're so dramatic. But a sunflower is actually not a single flower. It's a compound flower. If you see the way these bees are working, not all of the flowers within that compound flower are even open and providing a reward yet. So that's why they're just staying on that outer edge. Those are the flowers that are open and available for pollination, that have, you know, pollen and nectar available. And eventually these will start to set seeds and the middle will open. So talk about an easy target if you're a bee. You know, you've got a flower that big that you can just land and crash and then hit 100 to 200 individual flowers inside. Anybody know what this is? You've seen this presentation before, you probably know. Looks like a hummingbird. Sounds like a hummingbird. This is a night flying moth. It's actually the moth that lays those big larvae that were in Silence of the Lambs. You've seen that movie? So the hummingbird hawk moth. So this is a tuberose flower. It's a summer blooming bulb. Incredibly fragrant. One of my favorite flowers to grow. My neighbors across the street, 150 yards away, can smell this strip of flowers in the evenings in the summertime. Wonderful, wonderful plant. Don't mind the weeds in the back of the garden there. But this plant, and I have seen bees visit these flowers, but these flowers are really long, sort of bell-shaped. The bees have a tough time getting in there. So the flower size is not optimal, but then that reward is also more available towards the end of the day and then in the nighttime. So if I could encourage you one thing as you plan out your landscape is, you know, we are really, really fortunate in Georgia with snow, like most of the country is right now, but we have a really long gardening year. We can have things in bloom, gosh, some years as early as January, really on through 12 months out of the year, depending on what you have in your landscape. Camellias to mahonias, things like that. So think about at least a bloom window of, you know, February to November. Try to choose plants, especially in those sort of non-traditional bloom windows. So springtime, we know tulip, poplars, privet, there's a lot already out there. So if we only have a limited space available to us in our landscape, can we choose plants that maybe fill in some of those gaps in the midsummer or late summer, early fall, where we know there's not as much in our native landscape that's blooming in those periods. You know, if you're into butterflies, I mean, who isn't? I love watching a butterfly, you know, kind of lumber around the yard. So it's not just about flowers for them. They also need the host plants for the larvae to eat on. And then just good horticultural practices. You know, understand your site, understand your light patterns, your water patterns, where does water drain to, your soil conditions, kind of keep it soggy days after a rain, all of those things. And, you know, the longer you've been a beekeeper, you'll probably learn this in, you know, that first all-day intro to beekeeping is have a water source. Generally, the kind of muddier and dirtier the water is, where they like it. So all of these things are just part of a good habitat and a good diversity in the landscape. I like to kind of look things, you know, look at things on a little bit of a graph. This is just an example of something you can do where, you know, you put out the 12 months of the year and you start to fill in the plants that, you know, you can at least have control of. And so I kind of color code these with, you know, the colors of the bloom. Where you see a W, you know, that's a white because you can't fill in the Excel sheet with white. So, but that's the idea there. And I think the color really helps me kind of look for where I might have gaps. If, you know, I have just a whole lot of purple, you know, maybe I can try to add in some pinks or some yellows and things like that. So, you know, and if you guys email me, I can shoot you the example Excel sheet of what I have. You know, I obviously have more plants than this, but it's just an example of something. Landscapers use this when they have the big commercial entry point into a neighborhood. You know, they have a bloom chart because they need that front entry to look nice year round. So we can kind of steal from the pros and use it for our purposes. I always like showing pictures of the transformation here at my house because when I got here 6 years ago last week, I had some nice plants, some old apple trees and a magnolia, but aside from that, it was just some really bad grass, which actually is better for bees because it's a lot of weeds. But obviously it wasn't much for diversity. Aside from that early spring bloom with the magnolia and the apple trees, you know, it's more or less a desert for the bees and other insects. So little by little, you know, here on the left is sort of what I started with. On the right, I slowly kind of ripped out grass or just buried it in wood chips and just built in plants. These are blueberries up here. There's a few old apple trees still up here. Muscadines, and I've got another apple trellis down here now. Muscadines, blackberries, there's blackberries here, vegetables, and then this is all changed too. So we'll get some close-ups here in a minute. This picture here on the right, I think it was within the first year after I set the plants in. So it doesn't really take a long time. You know, don't money for a bigger pot. A lot of times that's what you're paying for with the price of a plant is the size of the pot. And stuff grows and fills in fast. So pay attention to those sizes that they tell you on the plant. If it says it's going to get 10 feet by 15 feet, please don't put it right under your front windows. You know, that's probably not a good plant for a foundation plant because it's going to want to always be bigger no matter how much you prune it. So, you know, right plant, right place, we use a lot within extension in the gardening world, but it really is true within the landscape because you don't want to fight against what the natural tendency of the plant is. You'll see my water source here. For bird bath, bees love that. I've got 2 bird baths within the yard. They seem to do pretty well with them. This was just, yeah, so I think this was the first year after I put it in, and then 2 or 3 years later. So you can see how, you know, the plants really do fill in the space. Back view of the house was pretty terrible before we got here. And the one thing I do regret is the canna lilies. Buyer beware with canna lilies because they can more or less take over an entire area. They do not play well with others. They're a nice plant, easy growing, but you know, just be careful where you put them in because they will dominate space if they're allowed to. Front driveway, you know, I had the obligatory, what is that stuff called? Big ugly grass that used to go on every driveway along with the Bradford pears. And just put a mixture of, you know, perennials, some annuals. I really don't do a lot of annuals because I don't have time. To me, annuals, you know, I can get the same color scheme out of some well-chosen and well-placed perennials and some bulbs. So see that driveway is kind of getting taken over now a little bit. And this driveway down here, this is the only place I put annuals right here, guys. And that's probably the case with most good landscapes or commercial jobs is that high visibility point, you know, right there at the front is probably the only place they're going to put petunias and pansies and those annuals. So, you know, think about that when you're laying out fig bush, front. This is an ice plant. You know, I don't see the honeybees go to ice plant quite as much, but the big bumblebees, carpenter bees really go to that. I'm sure the bees get on it from time to time, but that's a nice low growing kind of annual plant replacement if you're looking for one. This was last year or 2019 what it looked like. This is early 2020 what it looked like. And you can see, you know, good gardening practices where you do have annuals, just like your vegetable garden. You don't want to put the same annuals in the same spot every year. So you can see I had the Portaluca type stuff here in 2019. And then I followed it with pansies in 2020. Crop rotation, even if you're talking about flowers. And by putting in all these plants, this is the wonder that shows up. This is what I really enjoy so much about gardening and, you know, putting in all these plants. My neighbors think I'm crazy because I'm always out on my hands and knees looking close up at a plant trying to get a picture of one of these insects out here. So if you have Japanese beetle problems, you want to see this guy right here, that blue wing wasp. So it is a predatory wasp of Japanese beetles. They will lay their egg in the ground on those grubs. And as an egg hatches, the larvae of the wasp will parasitize your Japanese beetle grubs. So,
Josh, what is that?
and you see,
What's that wasp sitting on? What are they like?
good question. We will get to that a little bit later because I don't want to give away one of my quiz questions. How about that? Hoverfly, monarch, eastern swallowtail. And you see, so at least 5 years that I've been here, 6, we have had at least 2 hives here the whole time. So you would think all of these flowers would just always be honeybees. But in general, I probably don't have enough of any one of these flowers for the bees to really just take notice of and make a meal out of. But all of these other pollinators have really just come in and made a home of the place. So see the little sweat bee, the one at the top here, this is a really small picture. I wish it was a little bit better, but that's one of those very, very small green metallic sweat bees. That's a stone crop, so a succulent, and you know the blooms are just super tiny. I can talk solitary bees, or I can skip towards more plants. You know, I put up some stem nests and some drilled wood nests for some native bees. As I said, most of our native bees, 70%, are going to nest in the ground. And you know, you guys are beekeepers, so you're going to be thought of as an entomologist now by your neighbors, by your friends, people that know you. They are going to come to you first, probably for all questions, insects. So it's good for us to know sort of the difference between honeybees and all these other insects that are out there, especially if they're calling you to come get a swarm. You want to know, do they really have a swarm, or do they maybe have something else? So, so I put up some of these, just little rolls of paper. Some of them were bamboo tubes. And what I really found fascinating initially was look at the difference in the color of mud that they used to cap these. Each one of those is just a little bit different. So with these nests, sort of like our beehives and a bird nest, the bluebird nest, we want to place them facing south or southeast, about 4 feet to 8 feet off the ground. Your beehive's obviously going to be much lower than that, but this is more like a bird house. And they will come. I mean, I put them up the first year we were here before any of these plants were out in the landscape, and these stems got used by the solitary bees. This is what they look like on the inside. So, these are those mason bees. They're using mud to make individual cavities in there. And then you'll see all this pollen that they bring in. They lay 1 egg, and then that takes about a day. That takes about 24 hours to gather enough pollen to pack in there with 1 egg, and then make another mud wall and do the same thing over again. So it took that solitary bee about 2 weeks to do this one bamboo tube that I opened. Inside the paper straws, I found something much different. Pretty fascinating, actually. I found a bunch of bug parts. And so again, these are predatory wasps. There was only 1 cocoon in here though. So she doesn't partition it off and lay a bunch of eggs. And actually it's because she has to carry a bunch of prey or food for the larvae that's going to develop. And so she carries in crickets, katydids, and stuffs them in this paper tube, and then lays her egg and goes and does it somewhere else. And this is the little grass-carrying wasp that laid that egg there inside that nest. Really fascinating. These are not like our other wasps that are social in nature and then going to have more of that aggressive tendency. Anytime we have a solitary insect, they are going to be docile and avoid any sort of interaction with us, with children, things like that. So they're not protecting a queen or a stack of eggs. they're just going to go on about their business. So a good wasp we want to have in our landscape. And let's see. So everybody probably sees these in the springtime. Neighbors might think they have fire ants. They're not fire ants. They are ground nesting bees. And you can see they're pretty early. This photo was 2017 on March 25th. So some years, you know, it might be more into April. This year it might be. But a lot of times you'll get that question and they want to put out the, you know, the ant treatment to, you know, wipe these guys out. These are excellent pollinators. They are not aggressive. You can walk right over, you can mow right over this area. You are not going to get swarmed and attacked by bees. So leave them alone if you can. They're actually, you know, helping to aerate the soil a little bit. And they tend to be in areas where there's not as healthy a turf or dense a turf. So where these are at my house is sort of where it starts banking down towards the ditch going to the road. And that's what it looks like inside the ground. We ran into some bumblebees a couple years ago. My son got kind of tore up, stung. So they had made a nest inside our carport. We've got some lockers and they made a nest on top of those lockers. Generally bumblebees are gonna, you know, sort of make their nests outside underneath something or in tufts of your perennial grasses and things. So it was a surprise when they were just getting some things off the lockers and down comes this nest and these you know, small colony of bumblebees trying to protect their nest. But was interesting in that, you know, honeybees are not the only bees that will make honey. These bumblebees do make honey. They just don't make it in the quantities that honeybees do. And they can't, of course, be managed like European honeybees, but it tasted just like honey. I kind of squished some of those cups there and it tasted just like honey to me. I can't tell you, you know, what type of honey it was, but it tasted just as good as the honey I've pulled out of the hives here at the house. So good practice for your landscape. Really, you know, good landscape design is to always plant in clusters. Landscape design courses will tell you, you know, in odd numbers, 3s, 5s, 7s, things like that. Bees don't really care, but you probably want to have more than just 1 or 2 isolated plants. Try to make it a, you know, an established area of one type of plant. Anybody know what this picture is here? It's actually in bloom right now. It might be about the only thing bringing, yeah, there you go, henbit. My vegetable garden is nothing but henbit right now. And, you know, I really don't even try to prevent it anymore because it is such a nice early season source of pollen and nectar. So, so the beekeeper does redefine what a weed is, you know, something that weed. You know, there's a lot of pretty terrible invasive plants, but if we're looking at them from the beekeeper's perspective, privet is a pretty good plant, pretty terrible in our environment, but, you know, it does serve a purpose to the bees. The more shallow flower shape we can find, obviously for honeybees, it's going to be a little bit better. My blueberries, the honeybees don't do a great job because, you know, the flower is just a little bit deeper on a blueberry. It's kind of bell-shaped, and they don't really get in there that well. Those native bees do a much better job on something like a blueberry. And obviously in our pesticide use, you know, I spray my apple trees. I spray at the right time. You know, I'm not using insecticides when the trees are in bloom. You know, same with our vegetable garden. So, you know, most beekeepers, we're going to probably be using pesticides in the hive. So it's not a, you have to not use them at all. Just be wise, you know that if you have to spray sort of your cover sprays for your fruit trees, and maybe you've got clover underneath, you know, at least wait till the end of the day when the bees aren't as prone to be on that clover underneath. Or just don't use pesticides at all, but don't assume that organic pesticides are, you know, any less toxic or safer to the bees. They probably just don't last as long in the environment. But, if it's a pesticide and it kills a bug, then, it can be organic or conventional. And great ways to get plants. You saw all those plants. I'm on 2 acres. So, I couldn't afford to pay retail for everything I've put in here. So come to some of our master gardening classes. We do classes on seed starting, plant propagation, all these things. A lot of my plants are, either stuff I've gotten from a friend as a pass along, or I've propagated myself, or I bought one and then I learned how to divide it and things like that. So I realize, with everything else we have to sort of spend our money on, sometimes plants are not at the high end of our decision tree, but there are affordable ways or free ways to get more plants. And one of the best places for your sunflowers is, your bird seed. I actually grow some really good volunteer sunflowers because, the birds just put them in other places, and generally I just let them finish out their life cycle at that point. So look at your feed stores, Cloud Supply, Tractor Supply. I don't think Tractor Supply does actually, but the Cherokee Feed and Seed, all of those Ace Hardwares. Generally, if you're a vegetable gardener, you can buy your vegetable seeds by the scoop instead of in the fancy seed packet. And it's usually going to be a lot cheaper to do it that way, especially for some of the more common things. And I already sort of talked about this. I use a lot of mulch, guys. So if you have enough of an area and you need a lot of mulch, you might want to call the tree service or the power companies when they're chipping up trees in your area. You can have them just drop it in your driveway. But I swear by mulch. I think it's one of the best ways to both prevent weeds, but also to improve our sort of heavier, harder to work with clay soil. I don't have irrigation at my house, and I think it's partly because we've had like 3 or 4 really wet years in the last few years. But mulch is the way to kind of keep your plants in a, just healthy root zone. Helps to kind of offset the changes in soil temperatures and environmental changes and things like that. So a good 4 inches of deep wood chip type mulch is really the best thing you can use around your plants.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
We've always been told that freshly chipped mulch takes the nutrients out of the soil until it's had about 6 months to a year to age. Is that true?
Yeah, actually it's kind of the opposite of the truth there. So when you have that fresh chip, it can be hot because it's actually composting, but those nutrients are actually in there at that point. If you let it sit for 6 months, then those nutrients are being consumed by the microbiology. The rain is also washing them through. So if you can get them spread, the fresher they are, then those nutrients actually go down to the soil. Where that original argument comes from is, yes, things like corn stalks when they're dry, pieces of wood in the soil do rob the soil of nutrients in a way, because the microbiology in the soil wants to convert carbon. It wants to consume and break down carbon, and it needs nutrients to do that. So where there's soil in direct contact with, say, that piece of wood, that wood chip, yes, the nitrogen and maybe some of the phosphorus is being used in that, just in that immediate area to convert or break down that piece of carbon. So that's why we never want to, till in, say, our wood chips. But if you just put them on the top, say 3-4 inches. Now, if it's really still warm, that pile is still, heating up on a cool morning, it's steaming off the top. You probably don't want to go, say, 6 inches deep right against the neck of your small bushes or trees even. But we never want to do that anyway. We always want to leave a good 6 inches or so of no chips around our trunks of our plants. So Washington State has done a lot of research and a lot of publications on using different mulches and when to use them. And that's one of their garden myths, is not using fresh chips. You absolutely can, just not right up against the plant. But good question, very good question. Here's some examples of if you have a larger area that maybe you're just tired of mowing, or you're not going to put in a vegetable garden for a year. There's a lot of options you can go with, or even just a seasonal break in your vegetable garden. So this was a mix and buying seed at the feed store: white clover, crimson clover, and buckwheat. This was more of a late spring planting. Most of the time, your clovers are going to do better if you seed them in the fall. And buckwheat, within 3 to 4 weeks, you will be in full bloom with buckwheat. So if you have a large enough area, buckwheat can be a great plant to get you in that, kind of dearth period, that July, August, when nothing else is really out there. You're waiting on goldenrod and the more fall type blooming nectar and pollen. Buckwheat, as long as we have a little bit of moisture to get that seed out of the ground, it's going to take off and do really, really well. It's not the tastiest honey, but it's at least something of nutritional value for the bees. And you can see how fast. So this was, 30 days apart? Filled up, seed in the ground. 30 days later, it's 3.5 feet tall in complete full bloom. All right, this is the guessing game. So you guys turn your mics off. I'll try to think of a prize that I can get to BJ for the winner here. Or maybe it'll just be knowing you won. All right, guess that plant.
All good.
Apple blossom.
Ooh, what's that?
Apple blossom.
Apple blossom, yes. You probably known that was going to be my lead out, not just because it's alphabetical, but I do grow a lot of apples. If you've ever been underneath an apple tree during bloom, it is like heaven. It is like walking in heaven. Mild kind of rose fragrance. One of my favorite times of the year, that early to middle part of April when these things are in bloom. And the bees go crazy for them. This is a perfect bee flower. Shallow, white, mildly fragrant, sometimes a little bit of pink. Excellent. And I think that's something to remember is if you have the space, why not grow something good for the bees and good for you that you can then eat, right?
If you beat the
All
deer,
right, this should be maybe an easy one. Yeah, that's right. That's right. All right, next plant.
Blackberry.
Yep. You spend any time hiking outside, blackberries when they're in bloom, absolute bee magnets. Probably an easy one.
Camellia?
rose.
No, camellia.
Yeah, that's
Lillian, did you have a guess?
Gardenia.
Gardenia?
gardenia.
Camellia? I don't know.
The magnolia?
That big.
Oh.
Gardenia.
No.
Southern
Magnolia.
magnolia.
Ah,
Yeah, southern magnolia. This thing's big. And a little bit of botanical history. So generally, the beetles are more of the pollinator for magnolias because magnolias in the plant world are dinosaurs. Magnolias evolved before bees came onto the scene. So they are more traditionally pollinated by beetles. But obviously they're an excellent bee plant because all that pollen that's in that huge flower, they do have a mild fragrance to draw them in. But I pick them up all the time. We see the seed structure on magnolia is more of that kind of cone type shape, more of like a conifer. So the conifers are much older than our broadleafs and angiosperms. So this is one of the first flowering plants in evolutionary time speaking. This might get some people.
butterfly plant.
Close, very close. Same color scheme. Has a pretty strong smell to it. Has a leaf that some people might confuse with cannabis, palmate, compound. Very easy to grow.
Don't know that one.
Chase tree or vitex. Chase tree or vitex. So I've got 3 of them here at the house, and the first couple years, I didn't think they were a honeybee plant because I mainly saw bumblebees. You'll see some butterflies on them. But last year, the honeybees found them, and obviously they're just as good for honeybees as they are for the rest of them because, once they found them, they were a honeybee favorite.
When do they bloom?
When do they bloom?
Oh, good question. So they're going to bloom. They're going to bloom on new wood. So if you prune them, you can prune them just like your crepe myrtles. They're a small tree. You can have individual trunk or multi-stems. Mine sort of have multi-stems starting off of one single stem. And you can actually get them to bloom twice. So if you do a summer pruning, you sort of deadhead. Generally, they're going to have a long enough summer still to bloom very late, which can be a very nice thing about this plant. So, and I think this picture was taken somewhere towards the end of September. So if you do a midsummer pruning after that initial spring bloom has finished, prune them back, they will shoot out more new growth that at the terminals will have more flowers on them.
What was that second name for that? Chase tree or Vita?
Vitex with an X.
Vitex.
Vitex. Uh-huh.
Vitex.
Sedum.
Sedum, exactly. Really, really nice plant. You're going to see everything from the small little sweat bees and garden flies up to the big butterflies on these. Very easy to grow. They're a succulent, so a nice change of texture within the garden. And I like the ones in this lighter pink kind of color range. There's some that are more red. Another thing to remember too is when you're buying plants, try to get the standard plant and not the hybrid or the one that's been engineered more for gardeners, the double blooms. A lot of times when in those breeding programs, what tends to fall out in those improvements are things like pollen and nectar. They're breeding for other things, aesthetic characteristics. So, like your echinaceas, those new fancy ones that they come out, a lot of times are not as desirable as just the old purple coneflower echinacea. So something to keep in mind when you're buying plants is just try to go for just the standard plants and not these improved ones with characteristics like double blooms and different things like that. So
Non-GMO.
it's a good one. This is a yeah, well, there's not GMOs in the horticultural world for the most part.
Stokes Master. Stokes.
Yeah, who said that? Is that you, Trina?
No, this is Pat.
Oh, Pat, you know your plants. You need to
Lean
get
over, Mom.
Yeah, Stokes aster. Early spring bloomer, but not too early. Perennial, easy to grow, nice plant to divide every few years, share with friends. It will spread a little bit by seed. Really nice, easy to grow plant, full sun, and the bees, the butterflies, just about everybody gets something out of this bloom. Pat, let somebody else have a guess on this.
Okay.
Anybody?
Ask Pat.
No.
Native to most. Yeah, all right, Pat. Come on, tell them what it is.
I don't know. It looks like echinacea.
There you go. Echinacea, purple cone flower, really nice perennial plants. You know, so again, something you can buy once and eventually kind of divide and spread all over your yard. And you'll see the honeybees, the sweat bees, the butterflies, all over these. Very, very nice plant. Somewhat long bloom season, I would say. Those flowers will stay active for, you know, at least maybe a week and a half before they start to, you know, kind of change into seed heads at that point. Any guesses here? I might have stumped you on this one, Pat.
I don't know.
All right. This plant, I don't actually have this at my house. I need to get it. Visited a gardener friend who also has some bees a couple years ago in the spring. You have never seen bee activity on a plant like you have seen on this. This is St. John's wort. And my gosh, it was just, I mean, it's like the whole bush was just moving constantly. It really, really neat flower. I mean, it's otherwise, you know, kind of a nondescript plant. The blooms are nice, you know, but you're probably not going to want this at your front door or anything. It is a perennial, woody for the most part, but I'll never forget the bee activity when I visited this garden that I saw on this plant. So St. John's wort, nice, easy to grow plant. Guesses here? One of the few blue flowers that we have available to us as gardeners.
Just an aster of some kind?
No, not an aster. Might be in the aster family, but it's not bachelor button. I don't know the Latin. I'm not good with the Latin names. So this is we would seed this in the fall. Eventually it naturalizes and you can kind of just expect it to come back every year. We'll get about 3.5-ish feet tall and makes these nice little kind of $quarter to $half size flowers at the top of long stems. Bees go crazy for it. Really nice plants. Again, it's a fall seeded thing, sort of like your turnips and collards. So it's gonna, you know, start to grow over winter, and then early in the spring, start to put up the flowers and the fireworks. I love this picture. Head on with the honeybee in the field here.
Like red clover.
That's just red clover, isn't it?
Crimson.
Yeah, that's just crimson clover. Just crimson clover. And sometimes I've heard from beekeepers that, you know, the crimson clover flower isn't great for bees because, you know, maybe it's too deep or something like that. I've got it to where it comes back every year in my field, and the bees seem to go to it as much as the white clover. And you can see a picture here. I like this one more just for, you know, photographic perspective, but I really like that last one with the head-on bee in motion picture there. Sunflower, everybody's going to get that one. We already talked about them. So this was, somebody asked earlier, the blue wing wasp was on this plant right here. There's some clues at the top. Perennial, ground cover, long bloom period, easy to grow herb. That's just garden thyme. You can find lemon thyme. I really like the herbs for bees. I think they get some nice oils and secondary benefits from herbs. And thyme is great. Again, one, it's evergreen. So we all have that spot where we just want, you know, something covering the ground. And thyme is excellent at that. And man, the bees, the wasps, every insect out there seems to get a lot out of thyme. So, and I really like that it does have, you know, probably at least a good month of a bloom window on it.
Hey, Josh, are you watching your time?
I am, and I'm almost done. So we can
Okay.
finish up unless everybody's, I never know with Zoom. Hard
I'm
to read the
enjoying
room
it.
when you're on Zoom, so. Native plant. You'll find these all around Lake Allatoona.
I don't know.
Any
Sweet
guesses?
gum, sweet gum. I don't know.
Button bush.
But
Button bush. Yeah. The webworms also seem to like them. Later in the summer, early fall, the webworms will just, kind of come in all over these things too. But fun little flowers, those sort of disco ball looking flowers. But I'll see the honeybees all over these as well. Any guesses there?
Blueberries.
There you go. There you go.
Blueberry.
Blueberry.
Yeah. And the bees try, the honeybees try on these, but they don't really do a great job. You're going to find more of your, fatter blueberry bees or your brown nesters, things like that, pollinating your blueberries. So we showed this under UV earlier.
Black-eyed Susans.
There you go, Rudbeckias. Yep. And just go with the old standard garden variety. Don't get any of these new fancy varieties. Again, just the old standard, more native type are gonna do really well. Here's a video.
Lavender.
Lavender.
There you go. Man, if you can grow good lavender, you will be a bee's best friend. The bees will be all over lavender. Where I have lavender is right against my driveway, where, it's a little bit higher. It's on the high side of the driveway, so it's not getting extra water. And I've amended that soil so it's really light. Lavender is not the easiest plant to grow. It's Mediterranean. It doesn't like our humidity and our rainfall. If you can create cool conditions, so at least its roots do dry out. It does like it a little bit more towards, a basic type soil or an alkaline soil. So you might need to add some lime and pruning at the right time. So really the most ideal time to prune lavender to keep it coming back, looking great year after year, is right after bloom finishes. If you don't prune and reshape that plant, then that's when it just starts looking ragged and starts sort of dying back in the center and things like that. So prune it and reshape it right after bloom is done. Yes, it's a fun, easy to grow plant. You can seed it, or you can buy corms in bags at the big box stores. The summer bloomer, late spring, early summer. Unlike most of these plants that have a spike where there's multiple flowers, this one starts opening the flowers at the top and then goes down. Whereas our other plants, gosh, what am I thinking of?
Crimson clover
Yeah.
goes from bottom to top.
Yeah, and most plants will do that. Most plants will do that. I'm drawing a blank on the examples of the other plants I have in my yard. But this one starts opening at the top. This is Liatris, and I put it in my landscape because you can buy a bag of, those corms probably right about now at the big box stores. You get like 50 of them for 10 bucks or 12 bucks. And eventually it starts setting seed and you'll end up with it kind of everywhere. But it's easy enough to pull out if you don't want it somewhere. Very, very nice plant. You'll see bees on it. Of course, butterflies. That's a moth on there right now. Any guesses? Great plant for butterflies. You also find bees on it.
Trump.
This is
Mexican
Mexican
sunflower.
sunflower. You buy these- Yeah, there you go. You can buy these seed packets at, you know, any of the burpee seed stations at the big box stores. If you want to see monarchs, this is the plant to bring them in. This is a really nice, pretty easy to grow plant. About the only problem you'll run into with this is it may lodge or it may kind of fall over. So you might want to have something there for it to hold up its own weight at the end of the summer.
What's it called?
That was Mexican sunflower, common name. Latin name, I probably should put it down on these slides, but I didn't. Very common garden variety type flower here. You can find it at any of the seed stations.
Coreopsis.
Close.
Okay.
This is what they seeded the middles of 575 with. Some
Copies.
of the offering. Did somebody say Cosmos?
Cosmos.
Cosmos, there you go.
Good one,
And you
BJ.
can see here, it's out in my field. You know, the grass, I just kind of quit mowing where it started to come up. And it's doing well, even with, you know, Bermuda and crabgrass and everything else starting to kind of impede on its area. So as long as you can get it up above the grass, eventually it'll grow right up through grass and things like that. Point of reference here, these pictures were taken about 3 or 4 years ago, but this was in November. These things were still in bloom. So we would call that like a hardy annual. It's going to tolerate maybe that first freeze of, you know, just a light frost. Eventually it will die over the winter time when we get, you know, down in the 20s, but it will survive that first frost where maybe the fig leaves fall off. This will stay out there and will sometimes be the only thing in bloom after that. Calendula, very nice flower. Actually has edible petals, so you know people will use them in flavored waters to bring out the color of the petals and things like that. Very nice, easy to grow, and again, it's one of those that can tolerate a light frost or two, and will probably be the only thing out there on those first few sunny days after a cold night or two in the landscape. Tons of great resources out there. The UGA Honey Lab has got some good publications on plants. Extension also has a few publications on like trees for bees. You know, that if you really want to make an impact on providing pollen and nectar, you know, plant a tree 40 years ago, a flowering tree, that's, you know, way more pollen and nectar than any of these annuals is ever really going to produce. But, you know, you have to wait years and years for it to ever really reach that full potential. So, you know, you may want something in the middle ground, and, you know, the plants that we talked about today are a great way to help get you there. Some really nice books. I mentioned Joe Wilson's stuff, The Bees in Your Backyard. It's more native bee focused. One on the left there, I think it was like an $11 book. I got it on Amazon. It's pretty good. It's nice because it's just 100 plants, one page, you know, each side is one plant, talks about where it grows. And the nice thing about that is it also gives you the honey or the beekeeper's perspective. So we'll talk about the honey quality from that flower. Whereas a lot of these resources, they don't really tell you, you know, what does it mean for the beekeeper? It just tells you, sure, the bees like it, but oftentimes it doesn't tell you about the honey quality. But that book does. And I would say 75% of those plants are going to be keyboard type plants. There's a few in there that are more West Coast focused, but at least 75% of that book is for us on the East Coast. So that's it, guys.
Can
I
I
gotta
ask
get in my other program?
one plant you haven't mentioned that we've had good luck with? It's commonly called bee balm. What's your experience with that?
Bee balm, absolutely. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'd be on here till midnight if we wanted to talk about all the good plants out there. There's bee balm's an excellent one. Lemon balm. You know, those are herbs. So anything in those herbs, if they bloom, are going to usually be excellent bee plants. Absolutely. You just have to be a little careful with those bee balms, lemon balms, anything in the mint family. Again, they can kind of start to be a bully and start to creep into areas where maybe you don't want them. So plan for that. Either, plant them in a pot that's in the ground, or just, expect it to run over the other plants or the area. So yeah, absolutely. The bee balms and the mints are great plants. All right, guys. Thank you.
Josh.
I wish I could stay longer.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, BJ.
Great job.
Hey, Ryan. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Hey, Will.
Yay.
Okay. Everybody enjoy that?
Excellent program.
Yes.